Something shifted in the early hours of yesterday morning that the mainstream media is still trying to decode, but the silence from the halls of power in Washington and Paris tells you everything you need to know. Chairman Ibrahim Traoré, now standing at the helm of the Alliance of Sahel States, has just authorized a series of structural orders that are doing more than just moving troops. He is systematically dismantling a regional architecture that was designed to be unbreakable by anyone on the outside. This is the moment where theory becomes reality. The machinery of Western influence, the logistics corridors, the advisory contracts, and the financial signatures that have dictated life in West Africa for generations just hit a wall of sovereign resistance. We are seeing a deliberate, cold-blooded recalculation of power that moves through encrypted loops and informal channels faster than any diplomatic briefing can track. If a single young leader in the heart of the Sahel can successfully freeze the mechanisms that bind the US dollar to the world's most essential resources, what does that mean for the stability of your own financial future and the global order we were told would last forever? Is it possible that what we are witnessing in Burkina Faso is not just a local military shift, but the first visible crack in a global system of exploitation that is finally meeting its match? And why should every person holding a pension or a bank account in the West be paying attention to this specific silence? They often say that the loudest voices have the least to say, but in the history of the struggle for dignity, it is the quiet movement of a people who have had enough that truly changes the world. To my brothers and sisters across the diaspora, especially those of you who have watched the wealth of our ancestral lands build the skyscrapers of the West, while our children remained in the shadows, this is your story too. This is the anger of centuries turning into the strategic hope of a new generation. We are watching the birth of a new Africa, a continent that is no longer asking for a seat at a table that was built with its own stolen gold, but is instead building a table of its own. This is no longer just about Burkina Faso. This is a direct high-stakes confrontation between a small, determined nation and the massive, lumbering superpowers of the old world. It is a David versus Goliath story where the sling is not a stone, but the courage to say no to the systems that have kept a continent in debt for 60 years. But why is the opposition reacting with such unprecedented panic behind closed doors? What is it about Traoré's latest AES decree that has the guardians of the global dollar trembling? We are going to peel back the layers of diplomatic language to show you the actual gears shifting beneath the surface. If your heart beats for the freedom of a continent and the end of injustice, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is the fuel that allows these truths to be told when the world tries to keep them quiet. Share this with someone who needs to see the light of the new Africa. And right now I want to invite you to join a movement of spirit. Leave a comment below with the words, Africa Rise. Let the world see that from the streets of Chicago to the red soil of Ouagadougou, we are standing together as one. To understand why the ground is shifting beneath the feet of the old guard, we have to look at what happened in the silence of those first 24 hours. In the world of high-stakes military planning, there is a standard cadence to how things are supposed to move. When a directive is issued from a regional command center or a Western advisory hub, there are specific digital and physical signatures that follow almost immediately. You see transport units mobilizing. You see encrypted communication spikes. You see the support infrastructure of fuel and supplies beginning to flow toward the border corridors. For decades, this was as predictable as the rising sun. The West assumed that because they provided the training and the equipment, they also owned the initiative. But then came the morning of the AES decree. Strategic planners in Paris and Washington were watching their satellite feeds and their signal intercepts, expecting to see a coordinated pushback against the new sovereignty of the Sahel. They had issued the orders. They had activated the liaison contacts. On paper, the deployment was already underway. But then something happened that sent a chill through the briefing rooms. Nothing happened. The screens remained still. The logistics corridors that were supposed to be buzzing with activity were eerily quiet. In the intelligence world, this is what we call a non-event, and sometimes a non-event is more terrifying than an explosion. It signals a structural failure of the entire mechanism of influence. When we look at the data, the numbers tell a story of total hesitation, Historically, a regional force mobilization of this scale shows visible movement within 6 to 12 hours of the initial authorization. That is the baseline. That is the standard of readiness that Western advisors have spent billions of dollars to maintain. Yet after a full day had passed, the observable activity was near zero. This was not a routine delay. This was not a logistical bottleneck or a weather variable. This was the moment the soldiers on the ground began to look at their own orders and compare them to the reality of the new Africa that Ibrahim Traoré is building. They were no longer just following a chain of command that ended in a foreign capital. They were listening to a different frequency. You have to understand the role of the logistical hinge. For years, certain coastal states functioned as the gatekeepers for the inland resources of Burkina Faso and the Sahel. Everything moved through their ports and their roads. This created a sense of dependency that the West used as a leash. They believed that if they could control the hinge, they could control the door. But under the leadership of Chairman Traoré, the AES has effectively unhinged the door. By aligning the interests of the inland nations and creating direct sovereign corridors, they have rendered the old models of intervention obsolete. The officers on the ground are not politicians, but they are experts in feasibility. They looked at the maps, and they saw that the cost of resistance had spiked, while the predictability of Western support had evaporated. This shift did not happen because of a single speech. It happened because information is now moving through informal channels and cross-border family networks faster than it moves through official military radios. Soldiers in these regional units have cousins and brothers living in the liberated zones of Burkina Faso. They are hearing the truth about the dignity and the infrastructure being built there. When the official orders told them to prepare for a stabilization mission, their encrypted chat loops were telling them a different story. They were seeing videos of new schools and mining projects that actually benefit the people. They were seeing a leader who wears the same fatigues they do and sleeps in the same conditions they do. The divergence between the official propaganda and the independent truth created a moment of internal reassessment that no amount of Western funding can fix. For the analysts watching from the outside, this silence was a strategic aftershock. It revealed that the influence of the West is no longer structural. It is only rhetorical. If you issue an order and nobody moves, you are no longer a superpower. You are just a voice shouting into the wind. This is why the panic is setting in. They are realizing that their models for West Africa were built for a world that no longer exists. They assumed compliance would always follow command. They forgot that command depends on the consent of the people carrying the rifles. In that 24-hour window of stillness, the world witnessed the first visible crack in the foundation of the old empire. The balance was not disrupted by force. It was disrupted by the simple, quiet realization that the soldiers of Africa are no longer willing to be the pawns in a game that keeps their own families in poverty. This logistical chaos has a direct line to your doorstep in the West. When these systems of control fail, the costs of maintaining global influence skyrocket. We are talking about billions of dollars in security assistance that has essentially become a sunk cost. Every hour that those units sat stationary was an hour where the Western credibility was bleeding out. And as that credibility fades, the protection for the trade routes and the resource contracts that keep the global dollar dominant begins to crumble. We are not just watching a military delay. We are watching the beginning of a massive redistribution of tension across the entire global system. The machinery is broken and the man holding the wrench is standing in Ouagadougou. Behind every strategic map and every satellite image of a stalled military convoy, there is a human face that the history books often choose to ignore. We talk about logistics and command structures, but we must never forget that these systems are built on the backs of real people who have been enduring a quiet and crushing injustice for over half a century. To understand the fire that is currently spreading across the Sahel, you have to look into the eyes of someone like Musa. Musa is 48 years old and lives in a dusty village near the gold-rich veins of northern Burkina Faso. For nearly 3 decades, Musa has woken up before the sun to work a land that is incredibly wealthy on paper, but has left his children with empty stomachs and no shoes. Musa remembers the days when the big mining corporations would move in with their heavy machinery and their private security details. He watched from the roadside as the massive trucks carrying the raw wealth of his ancestors rolled past his home, heading straight for the ports and eventually the vaults of foreign banks. He saw the advisors in their clean suits shaking hands with local puppets, while the water in his village turned gray from the chemicals used to extract the gold. This is not just a story of poverty. It is a story of a calculated theft. For Musa, the global financial system was never an abstract concept. It was a physical weight on his shoulders. He knew that the gold leaving his backyard was the reason the currency in faraway lands stayed strong, while his own ability to buy a bag of grain diminished every single year. The injustice was so deep it became a way of life. Musa's oldest son, who is now 24, had to make the perilous journey toward the coast looking for any kind of manual labor because there was no future for him at home. Think about that for a moment. A young man born on top of a gold mine forced to leave his family because the contracts signed in Paris or Washington did not include a single line about the people living on the land. This is the old world that Ibrahim Traoré is systematically dismantling. When Musa first heard the young chairman speak, he did not hear a typical politician making hollow promises. He heard a man who sounded like his own son. He heard a leader who spoke about the dignity of the African worker and the right of a nation to own its own destiny. When the recent AES decree was announced, it was as if a heavy fog had finally started to lift from Musa's village. The logistical silence that paralyzed the Western military units was the first time in Musa's life he felt like the big powers were no longer in total control. For the first time, the truck stopped rolling out without question. The soldiers at the checkpoints, who used to look at Musa with indifference, were now standing tall and looking toward Ouagadougou for their orders instead of looking toward a foreign embassy. This is the human reality of sovereignty. It is the moment a father realizes that his children might actually be able to harvest the fruit of their own labor. For many of you watching from the United States, especially those of you who have worked your entire lives only to see your neighborhoods neglected and your hard-earned taxes sent overseas to fund wars, you do not support this should feel familiar. You know what it is like to see the wealth of your community extracted to build a world that does not care about your survival. You understand the betrayal of a system that promises stability while delivering nothing but debt. Musa's struggle is your struggle. The invisible hand of the global market that has kept West Africa in chains is the same hand that manipulates the cost of your groceries and the security of your retirement. But here's the truth that the mainstream media will never tell you. The reason the West is so terrified of Chairman Traoré and the AES is because they know that if Musa wins, the entire house of cards begins to tumble. The military crack we are discussing is not just about soldiers moving across a border. It is about the redistribution of justice. If the gold stays in Burkina Faso, the global dollar loses its leverage. If the people of the Sahel decide they will no longer be the cheap labor for the world, the pensions of the elite in the West are no longer guaranteed by the suffering of the poor in Africa. This is a grand chessboard, where the pawns have decided to stop moving according to the master's rules. Musa is no longer just a victim of history. He is a witness to its transformation. He represents the millions of Africans over the age of 35 who have lived through the lies of the past and are now willing to sacrifice everything for a future where their children do not have to beg for the crumbs of their own wealth. The silence of the Western logistics chain is the sound of Musa's voice finally being heard. But as the old system begins to crack, we have to ask a dangerous question. What happens when the empire realizes it is losing its grip? What is the real price the West is willing to make Africa pay to keep the status quo? We are about to dive into the financial heart of this conflict. Now we have to talk about the part of this story that usually stays hidden in the fine print of financial journals and classified economic briefings. It is the part that connects the red soil of Burkina Faso directly to the checkbook sitting on your kitchen table in Atlanta, Detroit, or Houston. You see, the military crack we have been discussing is not just about soldiers and borders. It is about the foundation of the global financial system itself. For over half a century, the power of the West, and specifically the dominance of the US dollar, has rested on a very specific type of stability. It is a stability built on the guaranteed flow of cheap raw resources from places like the Sahel priced in a currency that the West controls. When Chairman Ibrahim Traoré stands up and says that the wealth of Burkina Faso belongs to the people of Burkina Faso, he is not just making a political speech. He is pulling a thread that is connected to the entire sweater of the global economy. You might be sitting there thinking, why does a decree in a distant African capital matter to my pension or the price I pay at the pump? The answer lies in the mechanics of the resource dollar. Every time a nation like Burkina Faso or its partners in the AES, Mali, and Niger decides to move away from the traditional Western financial architecture, it weakens the demand for the currency that backs your retirement fund. Think of it this way. For decades, the global financial system has operated like a massive engine. West Africa was the fuel for that engine, providing the gold, the uranium, and the lithium that power modern technology and stabilize national reserves. As long as that fuel was cheap and the gatekeepers were compliant, the engine ran smoothly and inflation in the West stayed low. But Traoré has thrown a wrench into the gears. By forming the AES, these nations are essentially creating their own energy and resource bloc. They are moving toward a reality where they might trade their gold for technology or currency that is not controlled by the central banks in Paris or Washington. If you are over the age of 60, you have lived through enough crises to know that when the elites in the West start talking about security threats in a resource-rich region, they are usually talking about a threat to their own profit margins. The panic we see in the Western response to the AES is not about democracy or human rights. If it were, they would have been outraged by the decades of poverty Musa and his village endured. No, the panic is about the fact that the global South is starting to realize it does not need to ask for permission to use its own money. There is a group of people watching this very closely, the African diaspora. I am talking about the doctors, engineers, and professors living in London, Paris, and New York who grew up in the Sahel. They have the Western education, but their hearts are still in the villages. They are the ones who understand the strategic map better than anyone. They see that Ibrahim Traoré is performing a masterclass in economic sovereignty. He is proving that if you control the source of the wealth, you do not need to beg for a loan from the IMF. This is a terrifying prospect for the guardians of the old order. If the AES succeeds, it provides a blueprint for the rest of the continent. Imagine a world where the US dollar is no longer the undisputed king of the resource trade. If the petrodollar and the resource gold standard are challenged, the West loses its ability to export its inflation. That means the prices you see at the grocery store today are just a preview of what happens when the empire can no longer balance its books on the backs of African miners. Every time Traoré signs a decree that increases the sovereignty of the AES, it is a direct challenge to the unbreakable system that has kept your cost of living manageable at the expense of African dignity. We are seeing a grand chessboard where the strategy is no longer just about territory. It is about liquidity. It is about who owns the gold in the ground and who has the right to say how much it is worth. The military crack was the signal that the guards have left their posts because they have realized they were guarding their own prison. The Western planners are terrified because they do not have a backup plan for a world where Africa says no. They have spent trillions on a military-industrial complex designed to fight traditional wars, but they are completely unprepared for a young leader in a red beret who understands the power of a sovereign balance sheet. This is the price of failure for the West. If they cannot stop the AES from consolidating, they lose the ability to dictate the terms of the 21st century. For the ordinary person in the West, this means we are entering a period of massive volatility. Your gas prices, your interest rates, and the very value of the money in your savings account are now tied to the courage of a few nations in the Sahel who have decided they would rather be poor and free than stable and enslaved. So when you hear the news anchors talking about instability in West Africa, I want you to look deeper. Ask yourself, who is it unstable for? Is it unstable for Musa, who finally sees a path to dignity? Or is it unstable for the bankers who have been living off the interest of stolen futures? The truth is, the crack in the system is the only way the light gets in. But as this light spreads, the pushback will become more desperate. We are about to look at exactly how Chairman Traoré is transforming the AES from a military pact into a full-scale new order. To understand the true scale of what is happening in the Sahel, we have to look past the headlines and into the actual machinery of the state. On the 1st of January 2026, the world woke up to a new reality that many in the West refused to believe was possible. Ibrahim Traoré officially took the chairmanship of the Confederation of Sahel States, the AES. This was not just a symbolic handover of a title from one military leader to another. It was the activation of a Year 2 roadmap, a master plan designed to consolidate the sovereignty that began with a few military cracks and has now evolved into a full-scale reconstruction of the African identity. When Traoré stood at the podium to accept this responsibility, he did not speak the language of a diplomat looking for a handout. He spoke the language of a commander who had already secured the perimeter. He praised the outgoing chair Assimi Goïta of Mali for holding the line, but he made it clear that 2026 is the year of consolidation or collision. This is where the story gets dangerous for the old world. Under Traoré's chairmanship, the AES is no longer just a mutual defense pact. It has become a unified force with its own central command post in the strategic city of Niamey. For the first time in history, 3 African nations have merged their specialized battalions into a single fist dedicated entirely to protecting their own soil from both terrorists and foreign stabilization forces that have overstayed their welcome. But as any veteran of the great game will tell you, a military is only as strong as the currency that pays for its boots. This is the part that should make every central banker in the West lose sleep. The AES is currently moving forward with plans for a new regional currency reportedly named the Sira. And this is not just another paper currency backed by a promise from a treasury in Europe. The vision being discussed is a gold-backed digital currency. Think about the strategic brilliance of that move. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger sit on some of the largest gold deposits on the planet. By backing their money with physical gold rather than the debt of a foreign superpower, they are essentially cutting the umbilical cord that has tied African wealth to the US dollar and the euro for generations. For the American pensioner watching this, the math is simple and brutal. If the gold of the Sahel is no longer sold for dollars, the dollar becomes less essential. When the dollar becomes less essential, the invisible tax of inflation that you feel every time you go to the grocery store starts to accelerate. This is the new order that Traoré is building. It is a world where African resources stay in Africa until they can be traded on African terms. And it is not just about gold and guns. Traoré is working on a level of invisible sovereignty that most people do not even realize exists. In late 2025, the AES countries signed a historic deal to coordinate their radio frequencies and digital spectrum along their borders. It sounds technical, but it is actually a brilliant defensive move. By controlling their own digital airspace and rolling out their own satellite projects, they are effectively blinding the electronic surveillance networks that the West has used to monitor the region for decades. They are building a digital wall that matches their physical borders. This is what it looks like when a nation decides to stop being a logistics corridor for someone else and starts being a fortress for its own people. This is where the diaspora comes in. In November 2025, Traoré hosted a group of Afro-descendant visitors, intellectuals, engineers, and investors from the United States and Europe. He told them, "We do not fight only for Burkina Faso. We fight for the dignity of Black people everywhere." This message is resonating in the heart of the West. There is a growing movement of highly skilled African professionals who are tired of contributing their genius to systems that exploit their homelands. They are looking at the AES not as a conflict zone, but as a laboratory for a new Africa. They see a leader who is not asking for aid, but is inviting them to build a future based on shared heritage and mutual respect. Contrast this with the old ECOWAS system, the regional body that many see as a puppet for Western interests. While ECOWAS spends its time issuing sanctions and threats from air-conditioned offices, the AES is on the ground building roads, securing mines, and launching unified military operations that actually neutralize threats. The puppet leaders of the past were content to manage their own poverty as long as their foreign bank accounts were full. Traoré is doing the opposite. He is sleeping in the trenches and putting the wealth of the nation into the pockets of men like Musa. But as we see this new order consolidate, the pressure from the outside is reaching a boiling point. France is already trying to find a back door into the region through security deals with Algeria, desperate to regain even a fraction of the influence it has lost. Washington is shifting its posture from diplomatic engagement to direct resource control, realizing that the old rules of containment are no longer working. The chessboard is being reset and the moves are becoming more aggressive. What happens when the West finally realizes that the military crack in the Sahel was not a temporary delay but a permanent exit? What is the price of a world where the US dollar is no longer the gatekeeper of African gold? We are approaching the final layer of this story, the aftershock that will determine the fate of the global balance of power. We have to look at the reaction of the superpowers and the price of failure that could change everything we know about global security. As the silence from the logistics corridors deepened, the reaction from the global superpowers began to shift from confusion to a desperate multi-layered escalation. In Washington and Paris, the realization has finally set in. The military crack was not a technical glitch. It was a total system failure. For the first time in 60 years, the West is facing a region that has not only closed its doors but has changed the locks entirely. And the response we are seeing is a textbook example of an empire trying to regain control of a world that has already moved on. The first wave of this escalation arrived in the form of invisible walls. By early 2026, the United States has expanded its travel restrictions and vetting processes, specifically targeting the citizens of the AES states. On the surface, they cite security concerns and terrorism, but anyone who understands the machinery of power knows the truth. These are economic sanctions dressed in the language of national security. It is an attempt to isolate Ibrahim Traoré and his partners, to cut them off from the global conversation, and to punish the people of Burkina Faso for daring to support a leader who puts them first. But here is the irony. While the West builds walls, the rest of the world is building bridges. While Washington is withdrawing its troops from bases like Air Base 201 in Niger, creating a massive vacuum in their surveillance capabilities, Moscow and Beijing are stepping into the light. We are seeing a gray zone emerge, a strategic alignment between Algiers, Moscow, and Beijing that bridges the Mediterranean with the heart of the Sahel. This is not just about military contractors or infrastructure loans. It is about a fundamental shift in the global board of directors. When the Russian ambassador personally congratulates Chairman Traoré on his new role, he is not just being polite. He is signaling that the era of Western oversight in Africa is officially over. For you, the viewer in the West, this escalation carries a heavy price tag. Every time a drone base is closed or a diplomatic mission is expelled, the intelligence tax goes up. The U.S. is now forced to rely on a light footprint strategy, operating from safe neighboring countries like Benin, trying to keep its eyes and ears on a region it no longer understands. This costs billions of dollars, your tax dollars spent not on building peace, but on trying to manage a decline that was entirely preventable. And then there is the price of failure regarding the resources. As Burkina Faso moves to increase its stake in major gold mines from 15% to 50%, the global mining giants are panicking. They are seeing their profit margins, the same margins that fuel the stock markets. Your retirement depends on being redistributed to the people who actually live on the land. France, the old colonial master, is now desperately trying to find back doors into the region, realizing that without the uranium of Niger and the gold of Burkina Faso, its own energy independence is a myth. The most dangerous part of this escalation is the information war. The mainstream media is working overtime to frame the AES as a threat to stability. They use words like junta and insurgency to dehumanize a movement that is at its core a struggle for food self-sufficiency and economic dignity. They want you to fear the new Africa because if you do not fear it, you might start to realize that their fight for sovereignty is exactly the same as your fight for a fair wage and a secure home. Chairman Traoré has made it clear that 2026 is the year of consolidation or collision. He is not backing down. Instead, he is doubling down on the sovereign roadmap, expanding irrigation, mechanizing agriculture, and ensuring that by the end of this year, not a single child in Burkina Faso goes to bed hungry while their country's wealth sits in a foreign vault. This is the ultimate provocative question for the West. Can you handle a world where you are no longer the one who decides who eats and who starves? The collision is coming. It is not just a military collision, but a collision of values. On one side, you have the old order clinging to the US dollar and the shadow of the colonial past. On the other side, you have the AES, backed by a new generation of Africans, and a growing alliance of global powers who are tired of being lectured by the West. The military crack was just the opening signal. The real story is how the world will look when the dust finally settles. As we look at the strategic maps and the shifting numbers, we must return to where we started the power of awareness. This journey from a quiet, logistical silence to a full-scale regional revolution shows us that history is not something that just happens to us. It is something we create through our choices, our voices, and our refusal to accept injustice as a permanent condition. Ibrahim Traoré and the people of the AES have shown the world that even the smallest spark of sovereignty can set an entire continent on fire, a fire that cleanses the old and makes way for the new. If this story has moved you, if you see the connection between the struggle in the Sahel and the struggle for justice in your own community, then you know that staying informed is your greatest weapon. The guardians of the old order depend on your silence and your indifference. But when you share these truths, when you look beneath the surface of the headlines, you become a part of the new Africa movement yourself. This is a moment for a ritual of solidarity. I want you to close your eyes for a second and think of men like Musa standing on his gold-rich soil, finally breathing the air of freedom. If your heart beats for that freedom, if you stand with the dignity of every soul in the Sahel, I invite you to perform this act of faith with us. Right now in the comments below, I want you to type Amen and the words, Africa Rise. Let this be our collective prayer and our oath. Let the world see a digital wave of support that no border can stop and no sanction can silence. If you have not already hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, we are committed to bringing you the stories the mainstream media is too afraid to tell. We are your eyes and ears on the front line of the new African era. Share this video with 5 people who need to know that the era of the unbreakable system is over. The future is no longer a secret. It is being written in the red soil of Ouagadougou, in the gold mines of the Sahel, and in the hearts of millions of people who have finally decided to stand up. The military crack was just the beginning. The light is here, and it is not going out. Thank you for standing with us. Stay watchful, stay sovereign, and we will see you in the next deep dive into the truth.